All right, everybody, thank you for joining us back for our last panel of the day before we transition to our keynote speeches. I'm joined today with two of my very favorite historians to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is how did we go from neglect and distrust to this Hjelmeng, this blood alliance that we have today. It was not a straight path, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. So directly to my left is Dr. Catherine Weathersby, adjunct professor of Asian Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, my alma mater. And she is a specialist on the Korean War and the history of North Korea. In the 90s, she conducted some really pioneering research into the Russian archives to find out about the establishment of North Korea and the Korean War. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Catherine. And then next to her is Dr. David Fields, Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of a terrific book, Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee, American Exceptionalism and the Division of Korea. It's one of those books that uses a central character in the history to teach us all about the themes, about basically what we're going to talk about today. So this period, this post-World War II period, was uncommonly fateful for U.S.-Korea relations. Korea was liberated, divided, occupied, abandoned, recommitted to, pushed reluctantly into armistice, and then brought into alliance. It was a period of post-colonial exhilaration, followed by disappointment, a time of seismic geopolitical shifts, great ambitions, and also great suffering. The benefit of hindsight shows us that it was also an unlikely beginning to a relationship that has endured for far longer and far more prosperously than most contemporary observers believed was possible. So, Catherine, let's start with you and let's talk about division. What was the Soviet Union's strategy for the Korean Peninsula during World War II, and what role did rivalry with the U.S. and Japan play into their thinking?
Thank you, Jonathan. The Soviets were concerned about their eastern border. They assumed that Japan would remilitarize after World War II. They assumed that about Germany as well. In both cases, the former enemies did not again become expansionistic. But the Soviets assumed they would. So that's the first lesson, making a planning based on an assumption that turns out to be incorrect. But because of that assumption, then Korea became important to the Soviet Union as a buffer against a future attack from Japan. That situation, however, became complicated by the neutrality treaty that the Soviets concluded with Japan, because as long as they were fighting Germany, which was, a very, very difficult fight on their western flank, they were desperate to avoid also fighting with Japan at the same time. And so consequently, even though Korea was important, they didn't make concrete plans about Korea until the Potsdam Conference, just a couple of weeks before they entered the war, because of this fear that the discussions would be leaked and they would do something to prompt Japan to attack, which would be catastrophic. So that goes a long way to explain why what happened at the time of the surrender of Japan was so improvised and happened all so quickly and kind of chaotically. It wasn't carefully thought through.
Thank you so much. Really, really instructive. And David, let's turn over to you for the U.S. side of things. So, of course, this was a case of an account being handed over from Roosevelt to Truman. So how did their strategy evolve over this time for Korea, and what did Korean nationalists think about their plans?
Yeah, I'm going to follow Marcus's example and set a timer for myself to make sure that I don't go over. There's actually a remarkable amount of evolution that happens in U.S. policy towards Korea over the course of the war. So prior to Pearl Harbor, the United States had recognized the colonization of Korea. They had had several opportunities to rethink that policy and had turned them all down. But Pearl Harbor is really a turning point in which the United States first becomes very interested in the possibility of an independent Korea, actually investigates the possibility of supporting an independent Korea. But as they investigate that, they realize that there's real troubles in the Korean independence movement. So what most independence advocates are advocating, including Kim Koo and Syngman Rhee, are recognition of the Korean provisional government. The United States actually considers this, but as they investigate the status of the KPG in China, they realize that it is under the thumb of Chiang Kai-shek, and that he is hoping to use the KPG to further Chinese influence on the Korean Peninsula after the war. Furthermore, they learned that there's a group of Korean communists in Yan'an with Mao who are also hoping for influence in the peninsula after the war, and then that there's another group of Koreans in the Soviet Union who are hoping for the same thing. So the issue that they have is if they take any sort of action on the KPG, they risk starting a war for influence over Korea before the war against Japan has even been defeated. So they don't want to have Korea to be a bone of contention among the Allies. So what they do instead is the Cairo Declaration in 1943, in which they get all of the Allies to go on record saying, we are committed to making Korea independent in due course after the war is over. Let's take this off the shelf for the time being. And that's where Korean policy basically sits until about August 10 or 11 of 1945, so way at the end of the war. Because it's only at that point, with the surrender of Japan, that it becomes clear that the Soviet Union is going to be in a unilateral position to occupy the entire Korean peninsula. Now, Truman is actually under some political pressure to make sure that the United States makes good on its pledge at Cairo to see that Korea becomes an independent nation after the war. I think he also believes personally, and his advisors are telling him, the United States should at least have some sort of leverage. There should at least be some American presence on the Korean Peninsula. And this is when they suggest a joint occupation. They don't suggest division, they suggest a joint occupation so that there's an American presence on the Korean Peninsula that will hopefully give them some leverage in determining what Korea's future is going to be about. And as I learned from reading Catherine Weathersby's work when I was a graduate student, the Soviet Union accepts that for their own reasons. Now, what was the Korean nationalist response to this? To say they opposed it would be an understatement. To say that they were violently opposed to it, I think would be a little bit more accurate, because more quickly than anyone else, they saw the potential danger of joint occupation, I think, turning into some sort of permanent division. But they actually saw other dangers as well that I think we've largely forgotten about, and that was what they were even more afraid of was continued colonization, either being colonized by the United States, colonized by the Soviet Union, or colonized by both at the same time. And when you look at what General Hodge is having to do in the 3 years that the U.S. is occupying Korea, is constantly reassuring the Koreans that the United States has no intention of staying there permanently, that they're not going to recolonize them. But Koreans are not a particularly trusting people at this point. And if you know much about Korean history, it's hard to fault them for that, because this is exactly the way Japanese colonialism started in 1904 and 1905, where Japanese occupied the Korean Peninsula, allegedly for a temporary period of time, only until Korea was strong enough to stand on its own. Well, that is exactly what the United States is saying in the fall of 1945.
Okay, so very realpolitik considerations driving America's policy towards division, and now occupation is here. So what was General John Hodge never really imagined himself for this role, right? And so what is the strategy, and then how are Korean nationalist figures interacting?
Yeah, poor General Hodge. The issue with General Hodge is General Hodge and the 24th Corps are ordered to the Korean Peninsula before there is a strategy on Korea. Okay, so as far as his general orders are concerned, he's there to accept the surrender of the Japanese, to disarm them, and to repatriate them to Japan, which, by the way, he does very well. And that's why all of his reports start on the first page. It's how many Japanese soldiers have been disarmed and repatriated back to Korea. He does not know what the long-term U.S. policy on Korea is. That won't be decided until the Moscow Ministers' Conference in December of 1945. So he's on the Korean Peninsula for about 3 months without any clear orders, unable to answer the most important questions. Why exactly is the United States there? What are they going to do? And how long are they staying? Okay, he cannot answer those questions. And by the way, because he doesn't have any orders, he makes some pretty drastic mistakes in the opening days of the occupation, including announcing that Japanese colonial officials will be kept in place for the time being, all right, which just causes this enormous backlash in Korea, but it also causes a backlash in Washington. And he's immediately instructed that, no, you have to remove Japanese officials as soon as possible, meaning that you have to set up an American military government for Korea. The problem is he's commanding tactical troops. Okay, he does not have troops that are trained in that. He does not have civil affairs units. And so those first 3 months are really a disaster where he is forced to implement a policy that he's not really trained for, that there's no strategy for, and he's doing it with tactical troops. There's a really interesting account in his historian's journal where he's having a meeting with one of the commanders of the Busan area, and he's hearing reports about how badly American MPs are performing in Busan. And he's asking, what is going wrong here? And their commander has to explain to General Hodge, well, until these people arrived in Korea, they were artillery officers. Okay, they have no training to do the mission that they are now doing. So I have a lot of sympathy for General Hodge. And General Hodge actually does listen to what the Korean people are saying. And what they're saying very clearly is no trusteeship. All right, trusteeship has been discussed for Korea throughout the war, but it doesn't become official U.S. policy until December of 1945. So General Hodge is firing off cables back to Washington saying, I don't know what the plan is, but please let it not be trusteeship. Okay, trusteeship is not going to work. The Koreans will be violently opposed to it. And then what happens at the ministers' conference in December of 1945? But trusteeship is announced as the official policy of the United States and the Soviet Union. And just as they said they would, the Korean nationalists react violently against it. In fact, it's maybe one of the single issues in post-liberation in Korea that the vast majority of Koreans are united on is their opposition to trusteeship. Kim Koo actually attempts a coup against American military forces in late December, just as he said he would if trusteeship became the policy of the United States. So there's this tremendous blowback against this policy. And then it's only at the last minute that that Moscow orders Korean communists to support the policy of trusteeship, and then lets their policy known that only Korean groups who support trusteeship can be consulted to participate in that trusteeship process, trying essentially to create a communist minority government on the Korean peninsula. And so this policy breaks down over the next 3 years, and it's often portrayed as a breakdown between the Soviet Union and the United States not to be able to come up with a trusteeship formula. But actually, it's the Koreans themselves that play a crucial role in breaking this down because they won't cooperate with anyone on the issue of trusteeship because they are completely united in opposition to this.
Fascinating. And you had a little interesting story about Kim Koo.
Oh, yes. Kim Koo and Syngman Rhee are often seen as rivals. And in many ways, they were rivals. I tend to think that their rivalry was a little bit more tactical than strategic. And in fact, in many ways, what they wanted was the exact same thing. And they were willing to cooperate. In fact, if Syngman Rhee would have had his way in Washington in World War II, or even in the opening days of the U.S. occupation, what he wanted was the recognition of the Korean Provisional Government as the official government in Korea. That's actually what General Hodge wants as well. Had the United States gone along with that, Kim Koo would have been the first president of Korea. And Lee Sung-man was more than okay with that because he believed that he would be the second president of Korea. So there's actually a lot of cooperation between the two, even though I think history has tended to focus on their rivalry.
Really interesting. And Kim Koo also took a very fateful trip to Pyongyang, which ended up not turning out the way that he had hoped.
It didn't. And if memoranda and letters being exchanged at the time can be trusted, and I more or less do, actually, Lee Sung-man was well aware of that and agreed that he would tacitly support that effort by actually not supporting it publicly. Okay, so he agreed that he would continue to criticize it because that was more likely to be successful if their agreement remained quiet. And then Kim Koo was supposed to not criticize the UN-backed elections in 1948 at the same time. That agreement kind of more or less breaks down, but it's another example of Kim Koo and Lee Sung-man are talking to each other the whole time.
Yeah.
They're working together. Their tactics are a little bit different, but their ultimate strategy is independence for Korea at the absolute earliest moment possible.
Super interesting. And I just want to read, so if we were to think about if Kim Koo could look upon the situation today, he would, of course, probably be upset that division remains the fact on the peninsula. But there's one aspect in which I think he'd be very happy, and I'll read from Kim Koo's My Wish. I wish for our nation to become the most beautiful nation in the world. I do not necessarily wish for our nation to become the world's richest or strongest. Since I have suffered all too well the pain of foreign invasion, I do not wish my nation to invade another. Our national strength will be sufficient as long as our wealth makes our lives abundant and our military strength repels others' invasions. The one thing I seek in infinite quantity is the power of a highly developed culture. That is because the power of culture brings happiness and meaning to our lives and by extension to the lives of others. I think if Kim Koo were able to see Korea today, he might be impressed upon the power of Korean culture. Okay, so Catherine, over to you to talk about occupation. The Soviets are up there in the north and occupying and administrating things quite differently, and in some ways more efficacious and in other ways not. Interested to hear about why Kim Il-sung was chosen among other, perhaps better suited candidates like Cho Man-sik. So how did the Soviets look upon their administration of the north?
The Soviets were much clearer about what they planned to do than the Americans were. They had a clear program. Korea needed to be a buffer against an attack from Japan, and therefore they needed to have a reliable government. If they could control only the northern half of the peninsula, they would do it there. The whole peninsula would be better. Tried to do that in 1950, but in the meantime, we'll create a solid buffer in the northern half of the peninsula. That required a leader who they believed was reliable, was loyal. Kim Il-sung was really the only choice because other leaders were either in Korea during the period of Japanese rule and therefore away from direct acquaintance with Soviet officials, or they were in China and again removed from interactions with the Soviets. The only group they knew was this small group of partisans that had taken refuge in the Soviet Union in 1941 when Japanese forces chased them to the border. And that included Kim Il-sung. He was too young for this job. He had only served as a guerrilla fighter. He had very little education, very little experience. But they knew him. He had served at their base in Khabarovsk for 4 years, and they believed he was had leadership potential, was the phrase. Little did they know just how much leadership potential. But the important thing was that he was loyal, and he was indeed loyal until 1950. Now, they proceeded with dispatch to create a Soviet-style system in their occupation zone. They began doing that already in March of 46. That's very quickly. After they had reached the Moscow Conference decision that David just talked about on trusteeship, they needed to solidify their control over the northern half of the peninsula. And so they began with land reform in March of 46, taking the land away from landowners without compensation and dividing it among the people who farmed it. And then once they finished doing that, they proceeded to implement all the aspects of a Soviet-style system, a dual government between party and government, mass mobilization organizations, public welfare provisions of education and health care and so forth, a propaganda department, laws similar to the laws that existed in the Soviet Union. So all of that was put in place in the summer of 1946 after the initial land reform. So by the end of 1946 already, they were firmly in control of a state that was loyal to them and modeled after them.
This wasn't a question that we had previously discussed, but I wonder, from the perspective of the Soviet Union and from the perspective of the United States, okay, disregarding unfairly and unkindly the opinion of Korean people themselves, was trusteeship ever possible? Or was it just too much of an opportunity for the Soviets and the U.S. to shape and influence the geopolitics and national security that was relevant to them?
I'll start if you want
Okay,
to.
great.
Yeah. Protecting against attack from Japan was very important. Yeah. Japan had invaded in 1918, that tends to be forgotten these days, and occupied Siberia for 4 years. That's a lot. And then in 1939, Japan tried to move into Siberia again in order to secure oil for its military adventures. That only didn't happen because Soviet and Mongolian forces defeated Japanese forces in the spring and summer of 1939. And so then Japan decided to move south toward Indonesia. But so the threat of an attack from Japan was very real, right? You know, it's not theoretical. So that outweighed anything else. Trusteeship was something the Soviets went along with in their discussions with the Americans because they had to cooperate with the Americans on countless issues in Europe, in North Africa, in the Near East, you know, everywhere following the end of World War II, there were just enormous issues that had to be resolved, territorial issues, political issues, and economic issues for the Soviet Union. They had to have the cooperation of the Americans for a period of time, and so therefore they moved carefully at the Moscow Conference of December 45 to come up with some formula for Korea that would preserve their interest, in other words, holding on to at least the northern part, if not the whole thing, while leaving the appearance of cooperation. So have the appearance of multilateralism without the reality of it. That was their goal, and they did a pretty good job of accomplishing that goal, I would say.
Fascinating. David?
Yeah, of course, this is counterfactual and hypothetical, which is always dangerous territory for historians to get into, but it's all the public wants to talk about. So I feel like it's a more interesting conversation. And I have thought about this quite a bit, actually. And I'm of the opinion that actually trusteeship would have been possible if even a respectable plurality of Koreans had supported it. I think the United States would have been more than happy to ram trusteeship through. They would have been more than happy for the Soviets to manipulate that process, and then they would have been more than happy to leave the Korean Peninsula because they really didn't want to be there in the first place. They wanted to be able to say with a straight face that we have created some sort of independent Korean regime. The problem was, and they polled this regularly, they did polling around Koreans, they couldn't find 2 Koreans in 100 that supported trusteeship. And because of that, the only option for trusteeship was a completely communist-dominated formula. And that they could not accept. So I think there was a possibility there, but given the almost unified abhorrence, Korean abhorrence to trusteeship, the United States could not use that to save face and exit the Korean Peninsula the way they wanted.
And this brings us really interestingly to the next topic, which is the Korean War, right? Because collective security was such a point of focus for the Truman administration, and Truman himself jumping up and down said, we can't let the UN down, we can't let the UN down after Kim Il-sung invades. So let's talk about how, David, would you characterize U.S.-Korea relations in the run-up to the war? And then why did the U.S. ultimately decide to intervene despite signs that it maybe wasn't so interested?
I think the relationship would be maybe best characterized by mutual extreme frustration. Okay, especially Lee Seung-man is incredibly frustrated with Truman, with the Truman administration, because he believes that they are leaving too quickly and that they have not done enough to build up indigenous ROK forces before they left. So actually, the United States withdraws troops from the Korean Peninsula in July of 1949. It's sometimes you'll read that the United States occupies the Korean Peninsula in 1945, and we've been there ever since. That's actually not true. There's this crucial period from July of 1949 until June of 1950 when the Americans are not there. And the Americans were withdrawn over the strenuous objections of Lee Seung-man, who said, if you withdraw now, and if you don't arm the ROK, and if you don't give us any explicit guarantees there is a real danger that something could go wrong. And yet the United States does it anyway. So Lee Seung-man is very frustrated by that decision. On the other hand, Truman is very frustrated with Lee Seung-man and his regime because they will not stop talking about Bukjin Tongyeo, about marching north to reunify the country. And that is absolutely the last thing that the United States wants because they're worried about getting dragged into a war that they will be held responsible for. And this is part of the reason why they will not give Lee Seung-man the arms that he is hoping for. And there's another reason as well, though, and that is that no one is sure that the Lee Seung-man regime and the ROK is even going to survive. They think that there's a good chance that it will be brought down internally by communist subversion. And if they're sure about one thing, it's that if that happens, they don't want to be there when it happens, right? They want to get off the Korean peninsula before that happens. That's a big part of the logic of withdrawal. It's another part of the logic behind the Dean Acheson Press Club speech in spring of 1950, which is not a gaffe. It's a very clearly calculated policy that we want Korea outside of our exclusive defensive perimeter in case this regime starts to topple from within. And it's the explanation behind another facet that I think is often overlooked, and that's the death of Truman's Korean aid bill in the U.S. Congress in spring of 1950. Because U.S. congressmen are looking at this as well and saying, why would we invest so much in a regime that we're not even sure it's going to survive? So I feel like all of the signals are very clear that the United States is abandoning the ROK to its fate. And by the way, this is a discourse that's not completely irrelevant today. So why then does the United States get involved if there's all these signals of abandonment? I think in the minds of most American policymakers, they were imagining that if the ROK is going to collapse, if it's going to be brought down, it's going to be brought down by internal subversion. And they know that the Soviet Union will probably be a part of that. But again, there's deniability there. Okay, the regime could not stand on its own. It collapsed. What happens instead in June of 1950 is a massive army crosses the 38th parallel with Soviet T-34 tanks out in front. And it's undeniable at this point that the Soviet Union has played a role in what is going on. And of course, American policymakers somewhat overreact and think that it's actually the Soviet Union who's driving the policy, which it's not. But the Soviet fingerprints are so clearly there. And I think one way of thinking about this is the Americans were thinking that there was a good chance that the ROK would lose the last battle of a Korean Civil War. And if they lose that battle, they don't want to be involved. And what instead they see is what they think is the first battle of World War III. And that's something they absolutely have to be a part of, and they have to resist because they're worried about not just the ROK, they're worried about Japan. They're worried about their alliances, their connections in Europe as well.
Terrific. Thank you, David. Catherine, so any more thoughts on that? Plus, Kim Il-sung was badgering Stalin for the better part of a year to allow him and support him in his plan to invade the South and unify the peninsula. And Stalin was like, I like the idea, but the timing's not right. And then he changed his mind. So what happened for him?
Yes. Stalin was worried about Kim Il-sung's plan to attack the South because he feared that it would create a war between the Soviets and the Americans. He didn't want that, not in principle. He assumed there would be a war eventually between the Soviet Union and the U.S., but he didn't want it in 1949 or in 1950 because the Soviet Union was too weak to win it. So it was very important to avoid war with the United States at that point. And so as long as, first of all, the North was not strong enough to win the war quickly, that was one issue. If they could win the war in 2 weeks before the Americans had time to send forces back to Korea, maybe it would work. But secondly, the bigger issue was whether the U.S. would intervene at all. NSC 48, right, the infamous Acheson line, is, in my view, what did change Stalin's mind. Not Acheson's speech, however, but the policy itself that Stalin would have known about through his network of espionage agents, which was very extensive and very effective. I say the reason that it was not Acheson's speech because he changed his policy toward China as of January 6, a week before Acheson's speech, and that change toward China was part of a broader change toward East Asia as a whole, made in response to the American defense perimeter. Because as Stalin looked at the world, if the Americans are drawing an edge to the territory they will defend, then since he's in a global contest with the Americans, it was a no-brainer. He would move up to that line. That's really not complicated, right? So, therefore, he recognized Ho Chi Minh's government in Vietnam. He agreed to make a treaty with the new People's Republic of China, which he had said no to in December of '49 when Mao was in Moscow.
A fascinating little bit. And he even was not willing to meet with him. I learned from reading your research.
Yeah.
Made him wait for a month.
Yeah, Mao had traveled all the way to Moscow. So, and then, of course, he gave the green light to Kim Il-sung, and then supplied, all the necessary equipment for the offensive. But he remained very nervous, right? It's interesting that the nervousness about the possibility of American intervention is what led to a change in the tactics for beginning the war. So instead of beginning on the Ongjin Peninsula and then extending across the border once the South counterattacked, now, just a change of plan of just a few days before June 25th, now they're going to attack all the way across the dividing line with massive force. And it was precisely that kind of blitzkrieg with the T-34s, the old workhorse of World War II, that absolutely terrified everyone here in Washington, but also in London and in Ottawa and, everywhere, in Paris. The French president wept when he heard that the Americans were going to send forces to Korea. He said, thank God, thank God.
Wow.
Yeah, because everyone who had been through the war against Germany saw it the same way. Like, oh my God, the Soviets are doing what the Germans did. We didn't stop Germany. We ended up in World War II. We have to stop the Soviets or we will end up in World War III. Yeah. So Stalin got it precisely the result that he most feared. Yeah.
So much miscalculation, so much just misunderstanding and lost opportunity to communicate with one another. Also relevant, we haven't gotten into China a lot today, but no diplomatic relationship, of course, between the U.S. and the PRC, and therefore no ability to communicate, to even get a sense that what was a strategic warning by Zhou Enlai, the foreign minister, in early October, was not a bluff, but was the truth, that China would intervene if the U.S. crosses the 38th parallel, and that was not interpreted seriously. Everyone from lowly intelligence officers all the way to President Truman, and the role that no communication and no official diplomatic relationship played there. So let's move on to the armistice and the alliance, right? So this armistice takes over 2 years to negotiate, and it's supposed to very quickly lead to a political settlement, and it never does. It's still in place today. So, David, let's start with you. Why did the armistice take so long, and why did the end of the war lead eventually to both Koreas forming mutual defense alliances with their patrons?
I think it was Ambassador Kim who talked earlier today about never-ending negotiations or everlasting negotiations. I think the armistice felt like that. It takes almost 2 years, and there's two really big issues that hold it up. And the first one is POWs, specifically where are POWs going to be sent after the war? Now, up until the Korean War, it's usually, this is a fairly simple question. If you speak French, you go to France. If you speak German, you go to Germany. And sometimes people get sent to the wrong places, but more or less, that's the way it works. In the Korean War, you have a very much a different problem because the vast majority of the POWs are either Korean or they're Chinese. But there's two Koreas and there's two Chinas. Furthermore, tens of thousands of these POWs actually say, we were dragooned into this army. and we're not communists, and we don't want to go back. And if you send us back, they're probably going to kill us. And they're saying this to the UN command and to the United States, who has been couching this war in terms of good versus evil, in very moralistic terms. And so you can see that it would be very hard for a United Nations commander, an American commander, to turn over tens of thousands of Koreans back to North Korea who say that they don't want to go there and they're going to be killed if they go there. So what they decide on is they decide on a policy of voluntary repatriation, which, as far as I know, might be the first time such a policy is ever used, where instead of sending you back to the country which you fought from, we're going to actually try to figure out what you want. Where do you want to be sent? And then we'll act accordingly. And the Chinese and the North Korean response is a lot of anger. I mean, they say this is contrary to international law. This is not the way it works. And furthermore, they see this as a threat because it's going to look really bad for them if the vast majorities of their POWs don't want to return home. So this is a real sticking point between the two sides that takes about 2 years to resolve. But finally, what they agree to do is there will be voluntary repatriation, but POWs will be turned over to screening committees made up of personnel of neutral nations who will interview them multiple times, hopefully in an environment of minimal coercion. They'll try to figure out what they want to do, and then they will ship them there accordingly. So this takes 2 years to work out. So that's one of the things that holds it up. The second thing that holds it up is really Sigmund Rhee's intransigence. He hates the idea of an armistice. He hates the end of a Korean war with Korea still divided. He said several times he would rather it end with North Korea winning than with Korea being continued to be divided. Now, I don't know if he really believed that, but I think he was trying to communicate just how strongly he wanted this war to resolve the issue.
Why did all these millions of people die?
Yes, why did all these millions of people die if we still end up divided? So Lee Seung-man does everything he can to sabotage these negotiations. He will not let the ROK participate in them. At one point, he sends what has to be either the only or one of two planes in his Air Force to drop bombs near Panmunjom to disrupt the negotiations for several days. And then finally, in June of 1953, he does his most extreme action ever, which is he releases all of the non-repatriate Korean POWs. So all of these 23,000 POWs whose status has just been painstakingly negotiated over the previous 2 years, he lets them all go. And by the way, in the process of letting him go, what he has to do is he orders ROK Army soldiers to turn their guns on American soldiers who are guarding these POWs and release them by force. And it's a miracle that no one was killed. Okay, in one episode, there was shots fired. Luckily, no one was killed. But that is how much Lee Seung-man wanted to kill this agreement. And by the way, he takes this action after he's already been offered a mutual defense treaty with the United States. He wanted to make one more attempt to try to kill this armistice deal to continue the Korean War. It's only after that that he accepts the offer of mutual defense treaty. And by the way, American officials are so angry with Lee Seung-man at this point that they come very close to considering removing him from power. And this is PBS or Everready, Operation or Plan Everready. And it's ultimately Mark Clark who looks at this and says, we're not going to do it because we don't know who will replace him. We don't know if anyone can replace him, actually, with the same legitimacy. And if we find someone, we don't know that they're going to actually be willing to play ball with us any more than Lee Seung-man is. So they don't remove Lee Seung-man. And it's only after he's taken all of these attempts to kill the armistice and failed that he decides to accept the offer of a mutual defense treaty in exchange for tacitly abiding by the armistice agreement. He will not sign it, famously. No representatives of the ROK will sign it, but he will at least tacitly abide by it. And this is actually the foundation of the U.S.-Korean alliance. I think we'd like to romanticize this and say that this was an alliance that was written in blood during the Korean War. And in a sense, that's true. And that is a foundation of the alliance. You know, this is the Van Fleet Forum. I mean, one of the reasons Van Fleet is so committed to the Korean cause is because he loses a son in Korea, right? And he wants to devote the rest of his life to this cause that he has sacrificed his children to. And so that is a foundation of the alliance. But the actual words on paper are a result of Lee Seung-man extracting a concession from the United States in return for him tacitly abiding by the armistice agreement.
A repeat of a theme from an earlier session, which is that domestic politics continue into foreign relations, right? Okay, so Catherine, over to you for the Soviet, Chinese, North Korean side of things in terms of the armistice and then the subsequent alliances that followed. Not right away. It took them nearly a decade to get there, but they got there eventually. And I'll just add that your article on this and your research on this issue really clarified what exactly was going on, because there was a lot of confusion up until recently about what exactly was holding everything up.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, Stalin was very afraid of war with the United States, and so it was quite remarkable to him when the Chinese pushed the Americans out of North Korea, all the way down south of Seoul. Wow, that's amazing. The Chinese are beating the Americans. And so the war looked different as of January of 51. It looked safe, first of all. The Americans are not going to come to the Soviet border. They're not going to come to the Chinese border. China is able to keep them away. But also, Stalin decided that the war could be very useful for his bigger cause because it could keep the American military stuck in Korea for, his plan was 2 to 3 years, which would give the East European Soviet bloc countries, only recently, brought under the control of the Soviet Union, to serve as a buffer on their western border against an attack from the West. It would give those countries time to build up powerful military forces. They're not going to be a very effective border if they're not strong, right? Buffer if they're not strong. And so, therefore, let's keep the Americans stuck in Korea for a couple of years and let Poland and East Germany and Romania and Czechoslovakia and so forth build up military forces. And so when the armistice negotiations began in the summer of 51, he sent instructions to the Chinese and North Korean negotiators to go slow. Don't accept any terms the Americans put forth. Drag your heels. And so that's what they did. Now, China had its own reasons for wanting to prolong the war. Mao Zedong did, I should say, the Chinese leadership, which is that after it was stabilized, the Soviets sent advisors and equipment to Korea to train and re-equip all of the Chinese forces in Korea, turning them into a modern army. So in the course of the Korean War, the People's Liberation Army was transformed from a guerrilla force, a very good and effective guerrilla force, but nonetheless not a modern army, into a modern army. They provided not only weaponry, but logistics, communication systems, and so forth. Mao considered this the best military school possible. And so he wanted to keep the war going so his students could go to that school. Right. Now, the North Koreans, of course, wanted the war to end because they were enduring saturation bombing. I saw a Russian report from the end of the war that estimated that 85% of all buildings in North Korea were destroyed by the American bombing. 85% in the entire country, right? The only structures that were not destroyed basically were ones that were in valleys that were too narrow for the planes to fly through and bomb them. Otherwise, everything was destroyed. And so, naturally, the North Korean leadership wanted to stop this. They said the number of POWs, right, that David was talking about, in dispute, is insignificant compared to the physical destruction of our country. However, Mao rebuked him, said, "You don't understand the broader importance of this war, you must keep fighting." And Stalin insisted, "You must keep fighting." Kim had no choice but to keep fighting. But this meant that when, well, let me first add, so how did it finally end? Stalin died in March of 1953 of natural causes. And the first thing the new Soviet leadership did after he died was to draft new instructions for Beijing and Pyongyang to bring the war to an end, to reach an armistice agreement. So the new leadership in the Soviet Union had a lot of other things they were really worried about, and they didn't want to continue this situation in Korea. Now, China, however, delayed it a bit longer because of what David was talking about, of Syngman Rhee's release of the prisoners, also Mao, that Mao thought needed a retaliation. Also, Mao wanted to end up in a line that would be politically advantageous and militarily advantageous. So it dragged on from March to July for those reasons. But the essential reason, though, that the armistice agreement finally went ahead was that the Soviets changed their mind about it. Now, this means that on the northern side, the foundations for the alliance were also very, very shaky, right? The North Koreans had lived through the experience of having their country physically destroyed at the insistence of the Soviets and the Chinese. Now, what kind of basis is that for an alliance?
Right.
Right.
And I'd like to take just one question, if we could, from the in-person audience. So please raise your hand if you've got something. We'll run a mic over to you. So much food for thought here. If not, we're going to transition on. This was, I helped to plan this conversation, and I learned so much from it. This was so instructive, and you guys are so brilliant, and I'm so grateful that you came here and spoke with us. So please help me to give a hand to our two speakers today.